Okay, parallel method of reasoning questions. First of all, I want you to feast your eyes. Just look at how many words are in this freaking question. It's a long question. Literally, it's just look at how long it is, right? I mean, that's what I meant when I said just there's so many words in this question, and that's what adds to the difficulty. This is a time test, right? You have a fixed amount of time in which you have to read a certain amount of words. It's a lot easier for me to read 10 words in 10 minutes than it is for me to read 1,000 words in 10 minutes. That's a big part of the difficulty of parallel method reasoning questions. Now, I already mentioned in the theory lesson that LSAT writers know this. They tend to compensate against that difficulty by making the argument structure a bit simpler, right? Not by much, but a bit. And on average, it is more simple than what you'll see in other, sufficient assumption or weakening, strengthening questions. But it doesn't change the fact that you still have to evaluate one argument, right? Sorry, actually, this argument. The argument above refers to this argument. And then you have to look at up to potentially 5 other arguments. Each of these is an argument with its own premises and conclusions, right? They say which one of the following arguments referencing each of these. And we're supposed to evaluate the arguments on the basis of structural similarity and reasoning, right? So, let's say A is the right answer choice. Okay, well, what that means is that this argument gives itself to some general descriptive form. You can use some descriptive language like we did in method of reasoning. And if A truly is the right answer choice, well, then that means answer choice A also fits this descriptive, and whereas B doesn't, right? And C doesn't fit. Okay, so yeah, it's time consuming. When you first start, this is going to be, people have this experience. It's very common that this is the slowest, and the experience of it is the hardest type of question because you're just having to do so much more work. Evaluate one argument, evaluate another argument, evaluate a third argument. I mean, usually that's like 3 separate weakening questions where you have to evaluate so many different arguments, right? Here it's all in one argument. But given the repetitive nature of the structure of the reasoning that you'll see in parallel reasoning or parallel flaw, the more you do this, I think the rate of improvement is also faster because you're just exposed to so many more arguments. With, relatively speaking, simpler reasoning structure, you'll start to pick up on those reasoning structures fast, both in the positive sense of identifying the correct answer and the negative sense of identifying the incorrect answer. So let's give this a shot, right? Let's take a look at this. It says, suppose I promise to keep a confidence and someone asks me a question I cannot answer truthfully without thereby breaking the promise. Obviously, I cannot both keep and break the same promise. Therefore, one cannot be obliged both to answer all questions truthfully and to keep all promises. You see that therefore, there's your conclusion, premises supporting the conclusion. That's the basic argument labeling exercise, right? Now, to understand the support structure, this is not bad. This is actually a fairly strong argument because if these premises are true, this conclusion does seem to follow, right? Like, what are the premises here? And this is where we get into that abstraction mode, right? I want to kind of abstract away from it as I'm building out what the argument looks like because that abstraction is my map, right? It's my map for guiding me when I go into the answer choices, right? So there are 2 things going on here. I think maybe it's easier to start with a conclusion. One cannot be obliged to both answer all questions truthfully and to keep all promises, right? You cannot, do A and B at the same time, right? You cannot. That's the not, right? Here's the and, here's the A, here's the B. A is an obligation to answer all questions truthfully. B is an obligation to keep all promises, or you can flip the 2. It doesn't matter. Like the other one can be A, the other one can be B. It's abstracted away anyway, right? Just these 2 things are mutually incompatible. In other words, why, right? Like why? If you didn't read this argument and I just came up to you, I'm like, hey, you know what? You cannot be obliged to answer all questions truthfully and to keep all promises. You might be like, what are you talking about? Why not? Right? Why not? Why can't I keep both obligations simultaneously? Because the premise, right? The premises, I should say, the premises. Sometimes A implies not B, right? Like sometimes if your obligation to keep all promises, for example, I promised you to keep a confidence. You told me something is secret. I promise you my lips are sealed, right? Well, that means someone else coming up to me answering a question, I cannot answer them truthfully, right? Because if I answer them truthfully, I'll have broken the promise, right? There are instances in which A implies not B. Well, therefore, okay, then it's not the case A and B. Do you see what I mean when I say the reasoning structure tends to be kind of simple in these arguments? They're just saying this thing sometimes implies not this other thing. Well, therefore, you can't have both of them. I'll admit that if you're just starting with logical reasoning, and let's say you have no background in philosophy and you've never had to analyze arguments academically, what just happened here probably didn't feel at all simple, right? And that's fine. Okay, it's going to take practice, but you are trying, you are striving to get to a place where this does feel, relatively speaking, simple, right? That's the end goal. And if right now in this moment, you can even have like a glimpse of how that's possible, that's good enough. So we'll start with answer choice A. It is claimed that we have the unencumbered right to say whatever we want. It is also claimed that we have the obligation to be civil to others, but civility requires that we not always say what we want. So it cannot be true both that we have the unencumbered right to say whatever we want and that we have the duty to be civil. Okay, so you see the conclusion, premises. Now again, they give you the conclusion and the premises in order, right? Meaning first you get the premises, then you get the conclusion. They don't always do this, but when they do this, and it's when they want to modulate the difficulty of the question, they won't do this. When they want to modulate the difficulty of the question up, what they'll do is in the answer choices, they'll shove the conclusion in the middle of the sentence, with maybe even without a conclusion indicator. Okay, that's how they make an answer choice harder or a question harder. But here, take what they give you, right? The conclusion is right here. Let's start mapping the conclusion. Do you notice that it's actually very similar to this, right? It cannot be true that. So in other words, not that what? You see an and over here. There's an and. So perhaps this fits the A and B description. It cannot be true that here's the A, unencumbered right to do whatever we want, to say whatever we want. Here's the B, a duty to be civil. These two things are not compatible, right? These two things are not compatible. Okay, how do we support that? We in order for A to be the right answer, we need to support it where one of these things is shown to imply not the other thing. Okay, and look, that's exactly what this premise gives us. Civility requires, right? So civility here is taken to be the A. Requires, right? Arrows, requires that we do not always say what we want. Do you see? So if you want to be civil, it must be that you don't always say what you want. So therefore, these two are not compatible. This is what it means to have a reasoning structure that's similar, right? Two different arguments about two different things, totally different things. This is about keeping promises and answering questions truthfully. This is about being civil and the unencumbered right to say whatever you want. Subject matter-wise, two totally different things, but yet they are analogous arguments. That's why this is the right answer. Are they perfectly analogous? Definitely not. No argument by analogy is perfectly analogous. That goes to the heart, the nature of what it is to be an analogy, right? It essentially cannot be perfect. You are arguing from, one subject to a different subject, but here it's close enough in structure, right? It's close enough in structure. You can make it better, right? Notice that the stimulus didn't explicitly, look, I feel like A is just presented so much more cleanly, context, right? I didn't even mark out the context, but the context is that, I should keep my A's and B's straight. B, right? B standing for, we have the unencumbered right to say whatever we want. A, right? It is also claimed that we have the obligation to be civil, right? So B is declared, A is declared, but A, civility, requires not B, right? So there's your context, there's your premise, and there's your conclusion. Very neat in presentation. The stimulus didn't present it that neatly, right? The stimulus supposed to have a promise to keep a confidence, right? So A is declared, and then someone asked me a question I cannot answer truthfully without right? Do you see what I mean? Like B is kind of implied, right? The better way to do it, in my opinion, would be it is claimed that you have one has an obligation to keep all promises. It is also claimed that one has an obligation to answer all questions truthfully. But the obligation to keep all promises requires that we don't answer all questions truthfully. So therefore, right, so that would be amendments to the stimulus to make it much closer to answer choice A. And I do this as a way of saying the similarity doesn't have to be perfect. Okay, this A is the right answer choice, notwithstanding the differences I just highlighted by improving the stimulus. Okay, I mean, you could do the opposite. You could sort of modify A to make it a little messier so that it looks like the stimulus more. That's harder. I mean, there's a reason why I didn't do that because it's just harder. But the point I'm trying to make is that you're not looking for perfect match, right? They really mean it. It's most similar. Okay, they really mean it's most similar, meaning compared to the other answer choices. But the thing is, those other answer choices are really so terrible, right? So terrible in reasoning. Okay, so let's take a look at some of them. B says some politicians could attain popularity with voters only by making extravagant promises. This, however, would deceive the people. So since the only way for some politicians to be popular is to deceive, and any politician needs to be popular, it follows that some politicians must deceive. This is a much more complicated argument structure than what we see here. And first, we got to do the argument analysis. And this argument has a sub-conclusion structure in it. The main conclusion is here. It follows that some politicians must deceive. And the premise since introduces the premise. But the reason why we believe this claim is because of these claims. So these are the minor or sub premises, which supports the major premise or the sub conclusion, right? So that's the support structure. Now, one shortcut that you can utilize to chop down on time for parallel method reasoning questions, it's a shortcut that doesn't always work, and it's completely at the LSAT writer's whim whether the shortcut will work. But the shortcut is this. You just look at the conclusion and see if the conclusion matches. Right here, I think you can probably see that the conclusion doesn't match. Here it's just saying, oh, some politicians must deceive. Whereas our conclusion is that A and B are mutually incompatible. You can't both do this and this, or you can't simultaneously do this and this. Right? That shortcut works, again, at the LSAT writer's whim. On harder LR questions, you're going to find that all the conclusions are going to match. And then what are you going to do, right? And then you have to evaluate each answer choice. On harder parallel questions, you're not even going to be able to zero in on the conclusion because they won't give it to you as a last claim. They'll bury it in the middle of the stimulus without conclusion indicator. So then what are you going to do, right? You have to just evaluate the whole thing. But like I said, it's a shortcut that sometimes works. So when it does work, I do want you to take advantage of it. It saves time. Now, complete sidebar, complete tangent. You might think that, okay, B is the wrong answer. We've clearly proven it's the wrong answer just on the basis of the conclusion. We're done with answer choice B. Let's move on to the next answer choice. In a sense, you're right. I mean, yeah, for question 12 alone, if all you cared about was question 12, then yeah, you're done. But it's not really about question 12, right? We're trying to anticipate future LR questions. We're trying to improve so that no matter what happens, we can get the question right. And answer choice B, there's nothing inherently bad about answer choice B. I mean, the reasoning in here may well be the stimulus for some future LR questions. Some future LR question, you're going to see something like this, and this will be your stimulus. So yeah, I think it will make sense to try to understand how this argument works, right? We'll start with, how do you want to start? Let's start with this conception of all politicians, right? This is the set of every single politician is in this set. And we're saying there's some subset of them, right? I don't really know how many. Maybe it's everybody, but for now, I'll just assume it's not everybody. There's some subset of the politicians, right? Maybe we'll just say for this subset over here, right? For this subset over here, for them to attain popularity, for them to be popular, they have to make extravagant promises, right? Only by making extravagant promises. For this subset of politicians, if you want to be popular, you have to make extravagant promises. And this referencing extravagant promises would be deceptive, right? Making extravagant promises means you're deceiving the people. Okay, so that's all of this represented. What I call the minor premises. You can think of it as context, I suppose, right? But I feel like this is more minor premise. Context is more like what other people believe, right? That this is all just the author's position. Okay, now we say, since the only way for some politicians to be popular is to be deceptive, right? And you see that this has been shown already. It's true for some politicians. If you want to be popular, you have to deceive, right? They just showed that with these. Here comes the new premise, right? The new premise is that any politician needs to be popular, right? We don't know if that, like before you read this, it's not clear if it's true for the entire set of politicians, you needed to be popular. This premise tells you that, you know what, if you are in this entire big set, it is imperative that you be popular. Everyone in here has to be popular. Well, if everyone has to be popular, right? If every single one of you has to be popular, and some subset of you being popular necessitates you being deceptive, well then for that subset, you have to be deceptive. You see how this argument runs through? This is actually a valid argument. If you accept all the premises, the conclusion must follow. Now, yeah, okay. What was that? The last however many minutes we spent on this had really superficially nothing to do with this stimulus, right? But now you are at least a bit more familiar with a different structural argument structure, a much more complicated argument structure, okay? Now, what I want you to do is to come up with your own analogous reasoning for B. You can't talk about politicians, right? You have to talk about something. I mean, I can get you started. I'll say cats, right? The superset is cats. And then you have to talk about, but some cats, right? Something, which requires something, which demands something, right? And then you have to say, but for all cats, this sufficient condition is a imperative. And then you conclude, therefore, for some subset of cats, the smaller set, this necessary condition triggers, right? Then you would have made your own correct answer choice, pretending as if B were the stimulus and not just some wrong answer. C says, if we put a lot of effort into making this report look good, client might think we did so because we believe our proposal would not stand on its own merit. On the other hand, if we don't try to make the report look good, client might think we're not serious about her business. So whatever we do, we risk her criticism. Okay, so this sounds like a lose-lose situation, right? See, what I did just there was a very hand-wavy shortcut method of generalizing from this argument, right? What I said, lose-lose situation. Let's flesh that out. What am I really saying? Well, you have one option of putting a lot of effort into making this report look good, which will lead you to something, right? And then you have this other option of, I'm going to call it B, but really, you notice B and A are kind of you almost want to say like it's not A, right? If you put a lot of effort into making it look good, on the other hand, you don't try to make it look good. The reason why I'm hesitant to do A and not A is because I don't want to commit a false dichotomy error, right? This is a spectrum thing. How much effort you put into a report is a spectrum thing. You can put a lot of effort on one end of the spectrum or no effort on the other end of the spectrum. But let's not forget a moderate amount of effort. That's why I don't want to call it like an A/not A, because this makes it sound like a dichotomous thing, a 0 or 1 thing, right? Either you, like Yoda says, do or do not. There is no try, right? I mean, Yoda's wrong, respectfully, but he's wrong. There is try. Do you see what I mean? Like that's the false dichotomy error, which I don't want to introduce. That's why I want to call it like, I don't know, I'll just say it's B. But you have to understand that A and B stand in this relationship where A is on one end of the spectrum of putting a lot of effort. B is on the other end of the spectrum of putting no effort, okay? So one end of the spectrum, what's going to happen? Well, something bad, right? Something bad. On the other end of the spectrum, if you don't try, also something bad, but different kind of bad. So I don't want to lead it to same kind of bad, but different kind of bad. So I would say bad 1, bad 2, right? And then the conclusion is that whatever you do, right, A or B, it's going to be some version of bad. Okay, so again, this is a fine argument, just like with the previous answer choice. I mean, yeah, it's a fairly convincing argument, right? I mean, is it a perfect argument? Absolutely not, because it's just, you haven't proven that whatever you do. How about like a moderate level of trying, right? How about like, yeah, let's, instead of not try at all, and instead of putting a lot of effort, just some small amount of effort, right? The author failed to consider that. But, it's, what can I say? It's an okay argument. The crucial point is that this looks nothing like this. These are not the same type of argument, right? And again, I'll say that inherently with answer choice C, the reason why you want to spend the time and effort to do this kind of evaluation, kind of analysis, that you may even at this point ask yourself, hey, can I come up with another argument, an analogous argument from answer choice C that fits this cookie cutter mold of lose-lose situation? That's a good thing to do. That is a good practice when you're reviewing, when you're studying, because answer choice C will be the stimulus in some future question. D says, if creditors have legitimate claims against the business and the business has the resource to pay those debts, then the business is obligated to pay them. So what I just circled are the logical indicators that carve up and dictate the logical relationship of everything in the first sentence that we just read. From just this reading, this first premise, I already get the sense that D is not right. Because in our original stimulus, we didn't have this conjunctive sufficient condition leading to some necessary condition. So I mean, if the clock is ticking, I would already feel like D is not worth any more investment of time, right? But let's keep reading here. If a business has obligation to pay those debts, then a court will force to pay them. But the court didn't enforce it, so either the creditor did not have legitimate or the business did not have sufficient resources. So here's the conclusion. All of these are premises. And if we map out the conclusion, or really you want to apply the shortcut of the conclusion comparative method, you can again see that D doesn't look right, because the conclusion in D is is a not A or not B situation, right? Either not have legitimate claims or not sufficient resources. Now let's map out the premises. I already mentioned if A, then and B, then something, right? Then C. Here, I'm using A again because I already used not A to say creditors did not have legitimate claims. Here's creditors have legitimate claims, so that's A versus not A. And, right, it's a conjunction. B, businesses have resources to pay those. That's, again, because here it says business did not have sufficient resources, referencing the same concept. So here is A and B. then C, right? Then C, obligated to pay them. Now we continue. Also, if C, right? That's just the same reference. If C, then D. Court will force it to pay them. But here, the last premise says courts did not force the business to pay its debts, not D. So then what? So then you can contrapose back, which means not C, the business wasn't obligated to pay them, which means not A and B. Not A and B means not A or not B. That's just a rule of logic, by the way. You might be able to figure it out yourself, but there is actually just a rule of logic that says that the negation of a conjunction becomes a disjunction with each of the elements independently negated, okay, and vice versa, right? So in other words, D, again, is a perfectly valid argument, just like B is a valid argument. Okay, and you may well see this argument as the stimulus for some other parallel reasoning question. But the point is to recognize that this reasoning structure is not this reasoning structure. It's not similar enough. And so that's why it's not the right answer choice for 12. Okay, but again, these types of questions, analogy questions, just like the method reasoning questions and flaw descriptive weakening questions, I think these questions are the keys to unlocking all of the rest of logical reasoning, because they just give you so many different shapes of arguments, so many different, cookies that are so willing to reveal the cutter from which they're made, right? And it really behooves you to spend time with the structure of the argument. E says, if we extend our business hours, we will either have to hire new employees or have existing employees work overtime. But both new employees and additional overtime would dramatically increase our labor costs. We cannot afford to increase labor costs, so we will have to keep our business hours as they stand. Conclusion, premises. Again, you can probably just, this shortcut, quick and dirty way of looking at the conclusion, realize, that's not it. And when you're doing a timed problem set, or when you're taking a prep test, or, of course, on actual test day, that's good enough, right? You really are clawing for that last bit of efficiency, okay? But this is, you're just either learning this or this is review. You have to take the time to map this out, right? Not only do you have to take the time to map this out, you have to take the time to think about how can I come up with a analogous argument that fits this? Because your ability to do both of those things directly correlate with how quickly under a timed run you're going to be able to be like, oh, E is not it, right? So let's do this. Again, starting with a premise, or I guess we could start with a conclusion, right? Start with a conclusion, I would just say it's not A, right? Because this stands in opposition to extend business hours, right? So A now stands for extending our business hours. If you do it, then you are faced with a disjunctive choice of either B or C, where B means hire new employees or C means having existing employees overtime, or possibly both, right? Maybe you have to not only hire new, also have your, but anyway, that's a minor point, right? Next premise tells you it doesn't matter which one of these routes you follow, right? If you hire new employees, okay, that's going to increase your labor costs. All right, forget that then. Let's just have our existing employees work overtime. Well, that's also going to increase your labor costs. So you see, it doesn't matter which of these two routes. You imagine the route splits in two, right? Maybe you take this route, maybe you take this route. It doesn't matter which route you take. You end up at the same place, which is D, which is dramatically increasing labor costs. Oh, you can't do it. Well, you can't dramatically increase labor costs. Well, then that contraposes back. That means you can't do this, which means you can't do this. And that's exactly where you land in your conclusion. You can't extend your business hours, keep business hours as they stand. Again, perfectly fine argument. It's just that this argument structure and this argument structure are not similar, right? They're not similar. So that's why E is not the right answer choice. But I promise you, an argument structure that you're encountering here in the abstractive form here in answer choice E will be the stimulus in some future question, right? Or it will be the wrong answer choice again. How are you going to recognize that faster? By practicing right now with it.